Okay, welcome to the FantasyLabs podcast. This is Bryan. I'm here with Jay. We had a podcast a couple of days ago about 10 ways to be contrarian / stupid in MLB tournaments, and we introduced a new podcast series that we're going to do where we're going to pick a tournament every Wednesday, either on DraftKings or FanDuel. It's going to be a different tournament each week. It's going to have different entry-level buy-ins. It's going to have different amount of people. It's going to vary because that we really believe that DFS strategy, especially in tournament strategy, changes depending on what tournament you enter. And we want to break down practically what that looks like. So I'm here with Jay, and we are going to break down the DraftKings tournament. Jay, what's going on, man?
How's it going, Bryan? Yeah, it was good talking to you the other night about 10 ways, contrarian ways that might be stupid. I think they're all stupid compared to the one true tournament play, and that is to start Jerko every single time against Padres. I think you win tournaments. It's pretty simple. I think we can end the pod after that.
Okay. Well, thanks for listening, everyone. Yeah. But yeah, so we're going to go through a different tournament every week, and I think it's going to be good because we're going to pick different ones. Some are going to be lower entry level buy-ins that I think a lot of people play. Obviously, those are the biggest ones. Those are the ones that have tens of thousands of people. And then we'll also talk about some higher stakes tournaments and how DFS strategy potentially changes in those. And I think it's going to be good. So this first week, we thought we would start with a broad one that I think a lot of people play, which is the Moonshot on DraftKings. So this is a $3 entry tournament in which 51,000 teams play. And this was the Wednesday slate in which there were 7 games on the main slate. So a little bit smaller, which I think also makes it interesting. We're also going to break down over the next month. We're going to break down slates that have 15 games. And we'll talk about how that definitely changes things up for sure. But this, just so you get the context, is the DK Moonshot. $3 entry, 51,000 people, 7 games on the slate. Okay, so let's jump into this, Jay. The winning lineup, I'll go through this, was by Soupster62, and his 2 pitchers were Gio Gonzalez, Jeremy Hellickson, which we will definitely talk about, Buster Posey, Hanley Ramirez, your boy Giorgio, Franco, Jonathan Villar, Mookie Betts, Ryan Braun, and Bryce Harper. Of note, definitely some Boston exposure, a not full Boston stack, which is actually pretty rare in the top 50 here. Most of those teams had a full-on stack. This guy had 2 Red Sox, and he also had Buster Posey on the other side of that game. They were implied to not score very much against Pomeranz, but Posey ended up having a nice game, or at least a decent enough game to put this guy over the edge. But only took 2 Boston guys in a game in which they scored 11 runs. So that's sort of contrarian in its own mind. But I think that the big thing that stands out, and we'll talk a little bit about this, and this wasn't one of our 10 ways, but I think it's a really, really nice way to be contrarian, and it's just a sort of a great topic how this worked out, is the Hanley Ramirez play at first base over David Ortiz. Jay, what were your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, this definitely stood out to me right away, and it is something we didn't get into with the 10 ways to be contrarian. This is definitely one way. We'll get into a little bit more, but yeah, the top 20 teams in this tournament all had Hanley Ramirez. Of course, he hit 3 home runs, which I think isn't something – that's not what you want to get into too much, is harp on the 3 home run game. There have only been 55 3 home run games in the last 6 years since I started playing DFS. So, I mean, it's something that doesn't happen very often. But the big takeaway is that the Red Sox were implied at 6.2 runs, and David Ortiz was also a Boston first baseman, like Hanley and like Travis Shaw. And you saw everybody go with David Ortiz, which left Hanley's ownership at 8%, I think. So that's definitely an interesting strategy, one that we should probably get into. So, yeah, how do you think you go about that? I mean, this is a team that's clearly the chalk stack of the night. I think we've talked about before how you have to get contrarian, especially on a 7-game slate, stacking the top team. And this is a prime example of why you want to do that.
Yeah, and it is a great so on DraftKings, or especially and sometimes on FanDuel, you have guys on the same team or in the same lineup that have the same position. Obviously, you can only choose one of them if they don't have multi-eligibility. So in this slate, you had to choose between David Ortiz, who was hitting lower in the order, or you had to choose between Hanley Ramirez. David Ortiz, we don't have to talk about him. He's got an almost 400 ISO versus right-handed pitchers. He crushes righties. slugging percentage out of this world. Like, he was the chalkiest batter on the slate. Like, everyone, the Red Sox were had to score almost 6.5 runs. That was significantly higher than any other team, and Ortiz was the best batter. It was just chalk. Like, it seemed like you just have to have him, which made it such an anti-fragile, great strategy to not only fade him, but to get exposure to a guy that people were going to be less owned anyway. If David Ortiz was out, Hanley Ramirez's ownership would be a lot higher, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, I mean, it'd be insane. Everybody wanted a piece of the Red Sox team, and you look at Ortiz, like you said, statistics are all there. He's the third highest hitter in the Bales model. So everybody was going to gravitate towards him. So I think a lot of these guys thought, pivoting to Hanley, getting him at 8% compared to 35% Ortiz was a really savvy move. And, it proved to be successful. Obviously, I doubt any of them thought he was going to hit 3 home runs. But the upside is there that if Hanley has a good game and Ortiz doesn't, you pass a lot of those Red Sox stacks, which are the highest owned stacks in the tournament.
Yeah, and this was a great way to not fade the Red Sox because, they were just so high implied. And one thing that we didn't perhaps mention as much as we should have is you can still be really chalky. Like, chalky is not a bad thing. Chalky just sort of means the optimal play, and they're optimal for reasons. It's because they're implied to score a lot of runs by Vegas, who we know are set the most predictive line. So it's not bad to be chalky. You just have to sort of get around just being completely chalk. So taking Hanley over David Ortiz, even though it's a little hindsight here with the 3 home runs, and that's not what we're talking about. But the process of still getting exposure to that high implied total of the Red Sox, just doing it in a different way with a player that was going to be lower owned than he should be, just if there was another first baseman who was an all-world first baseman in front of him in the lineup that you had to take, or Hanley, really just lowered his ownership and just put him in an amazing spot. And the guys – that rostered him over Ortiz.
Yeah.
You're right. Yeah,
it was really hard, and I think you can even take strategy and go forward.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, definitely agree. And you're right. It's not like you had to get the 3 home runs. You just needed Hanley to outscore Ortiz, period, right?
Yeah, exactly. And there are other examples of this. You can look ahead to tomorrow's slate, even just at this first base position. But I think positional pivots are so huge and crucial for these size tournaments. You got Pedro Alvarez as first baseman. You can take over Chris Davis. Mike Napoli over Carlos Santana as an example. Even Justin Morneau, who for some reason is hitting like clean upper 5th right now. Over Jose Abreu, you can take Victor Martinez instead of Miguel Cabrera. There are a lot of examples where you're going to get that second guy at much lower ownership, still get a piece of that team if they're in a good position, and get past those same team stacks.
Yeah, and we're not saying to do that with teams that are implied to score only like 3 runs. But the brilliance of this move was not only were you leveraging that the same position switch, but you're also still getting the benefits of the upside. So you were keeping your upside, just getting uniqueness, and that's sort of the best way to be contrarian, is to stay with the upside, but to just get it in a different way. And they got it in a different way, and it vaulted them up the lineup. So let's talk about pitchers a little bit, Jay. So the winning lineup had Jeremy Hellickson. So this is really, really interesting to me. So if you look at the slate, there were a lot of guys in the 7K range. There is Hellickson. There is Gio Gonzalez, who is right in that mid 7K range. There is Michael Pineda, who is a chalk guy like Gio. And then Garcia was the other chalk guy. Yeah, Ame Garcia. And these guys were all in that same range. And all 3 of those guys, minus Hellickson, were chalky plays in good spots. Pineda was implied to not score, not allow that many points, or not allow that many runs, and these other guys were in similarly good spots. Hellickson was implied to allow 4.7 runs. He was the crazy outlier of the group, the bad play. He was rated pretty low in our models, yet he outscored everyone and ended up in the winning lineup. I'm curious your thoughts on Hellickson. Is this a contrarian play? Can you put something to it, or was this more in the stupid worked out category?
I I mean, we could sit here and put something to it now that he was on the winning lineup out of 51,000 teams. So it's not hard for me to make up something. But yeah, I wasn't on him too high. I think there are a couple reasons why you could take them. I'll let you take the second. But one reason that stood out for me is that, like you talked about in the beginning, all these pitchers were so highly priced. There were only like 4 pitchers. Pineda was obvious chalk after Chris Davis, Manny Machado, Adam Jones, and Matt Wieters were all in the lineup. He was a given. I think even in tournaments, you want that exposure. Gio made a lot of sense. Jaime was also chalk facing the Padres, but one that I can get behind fading. So that leaves you all these guys at a similar price range. If you're looking to diversify on a 7-game slate in a large field tournament, Hellickson's at that same price. Well, he doesn't have the surface stats, or he wasn't in a great spot with the implied opponent's run total as the other guys. Baseball is such a volatile sport. Variance is huge that I'm fine taking pitchers like Hellickson in that spot to diversify from those other similarly priced pitchers. So that's kind of some strategy behind that I could see. You can take the other point that we talked about earlier if you want.
Yeah, so mostly when I was breaking down this tournament earlier, before we got on the pod, I really was just trying to figure out why this guy took Hellickson, or even just put myself in this guy's shoes and, okay, why would I take Hellickson? What sort of thing would cause me to do that? And the only thing I could think of, because all of these guys in his similar price range were implied to allow 4 runs or less in pretty good spots. Just there's no reason why you would take Hellickson in a similar spot at a similar price range implied to allow 4.7 runs. But then I went to his advanced stats, and I might be reaching here, but he did have the best advanced stats going into the game. He had an exit velocity allowed of 86 miles per hour. That was pretty significantly better than any of those guys around him. Batted ball distance allowed of 193 feet, and his hard hit differential was 17%, which was twice as good as really any other pitcher on the slate. So my only thought is, maybe there's a situation in which you're looking at all these guys and you're saying, okay, I need to get off these chalk. And these chalk pitchers in the 7K range are definitely going to be chalk. Hellickson has a bad line at 4.7, but maybe that's wrong. I'm not usually in the camp of, trying to find inefficiencies with Vegas data. That's just I don't think that's a good, efficient move. But perhaps maybe you think, okay, Hellickson is in good form. I don't like the pitchers on this slate anyway. Like if the best pitcher is Garcia or Pineda, then that's not a great spot to be in. So, maybe I just take a guy who I think is pitching okay right now. And I think in a $51,000 or 51,000 person tournament that's only cost $3, I think that's a worthwhile dart to throw. You can sort of justify anything when there's only $3 and 51,000 people. But I think this is a higher stakes tournament with less people. It would be sort of hard to justify that, I guess, in my mind.
Yeah, it's a little tough, but there is reason there behind it. I mean, this tournament was interesting with it being a 7-game slate and the pitching just not being good. You're right. None of the top pitchers were that appealing. I mean, Pineda is my favorite, but how many times has he burned us before? So it's not a spot where there was just a for sure, guy you can't fade and you're stupid by playing Hellickson. I think these guys are all similarly grouped in terms of talent to where you mix and match and play kind of off of the exposure and projected ownerships. You knew some of these guys are going to be very chalky. So I like the pivot idea to Hellickson to get him at a lower ownership. And then he stacked, he got a few Red Sox guys in there as well. So I think overall it was fine strategy. So
if you knew like Pineda, for example, was 38%, and you are not very high on pitchers in the slate, for like this slate, for example, is 38 just too high? Is that, I don't want to say it's an auto fade, but if you just don't like pitching and a guy's going to be approaching 40%, is that just a pretty strong suggestion to fade?
I don't think there's a certain number, a specific percentage where you can just say, okay, if he reaches this level, I'm going to fade him. I think it differs so much night to night, the depth of pitching, the upside of that top tier of pitching, the pricing, how your team forms. Obviously, size tournament for this one, for example, I think in most cases you'll have guys where maybe Scherzer's just the standalone top pitcher. He might get up to 45%, but if there's nobody that touches his ceiling in a tournament, then I'm totally fine going. On DraftKings, you get 2 pitchers, so I don't think you need to fade a guy just because he's going to be chalky if all the right reasons are there. And I think Pineda with that Baltimore lineup when that came out, I think was pretty big, and I definitely wouldn't have faded him, but I think you can make a case for going 1 chalk and 1 non-chalk, and that would mean you'd fade Jaime Garcia, who might not have the greatest strikeout upside, which we kind of saw last night. He didn't pitch too well. So I think there's no hard percentage, but I do think when the opportunity presents itself to fade a high-owned guy, if you have other guys to pivot to, then it makes sense.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's tough to figure out, like what ownership is definitely too high. And it's slate specific. I think that I would probably a little bit off of him. I understand his ownership given that Chris Davis and Manny Machado were sort of late not scratches, but just late to not be in the lineup unless, like that line dipped and we thought Pineda would be in a really good spot. And he was, he pitched well. But yeah, it's always interesting to figure, where that line is between too high and a guy that you still want. But I think the important thing, and we said this at the beginning of the podcast, is that you can be chalky. Like the top guys in this tournament were guys who took a lot of Boston batters. You can be chalky. The important thing is that your lineup as a whole is unique. It doesn't matter whether you can take a guy that's 100% owned and still be okay. Maybe that's not the optimal thing in a tournament, but you can take that guy and it still be okay as long as your lineup as a whole is unique. And that's, I think, what people miss. They focus too much on single player ownership and don't focus so much on the fact that their lineup is what matters, not a single player.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I guess we can briefly mention the other pitcher who was the highest salaried player with Drew Pomeranz. And with this pitching being that brutal anyways, and his salary, making his first start on the Red Sox, playing in a much tougher park, obviously, I think that was a pretty easy fade. I was surprised people even kind of considered him too much on this slate.
Yeah. So I am curious what you thought. So, all right. So there was obviously the Boston stack was the stack to take. But some of these lower implied, or these guys later in the order for Boston, obviously we have Hanley, who ended up hitting 5th as the first baseman right behind Ortiz, who was hitting 4th at the same position. We talked about that. But you even have a guy like Brock Holt, not on the right side of his splits for his WOBA. He's about a no splits guy. Not an amazing hitter, but he hit 9th for the Red Sox, but only about 4.5% ownership. I'm curious your thoughts on that number, because that seems, a team that's implied to score so many more runs, even a 9th guy, and we talked about this low implied guys, that seems to be an advantageous spot. But what do you think about Brock Holt? I don't think he was in the winning lineup, but he was in, some of the top lineups, mostly because they included Boston stacks.
Yeah, this is kind of along the same lines of Hanley, outside of pivoting off the same position player, but in terms of getting exposure to the clearly highest owned stack of the night, but doing so in a contrarian manner. And I think we talked about in the last pod, starting your stack AL teams with the 9-hitter and going 9 through 3, for example, or 9 through 4 as your 5-man stack. But I think that's a strategy that not a lot of people use, and some teams have better 9-hole hitters than others. I think Holt's a guy that can definitely produce a good line, and you never know when the bottom of lineups just really come through in these types of games. So they had a lot of hits. They had 16 hits, so you spread the exposure around, and some of these chalky players miss and some of the lower owned guys hit, and I think you need to take chances on examples of Holt. And with that, they were implied at 6.2 runs, which was like a full run more than any other team. So this is kind of an extreme example of this team was clearly the team to stack. And it is surprising to see Holt's ownership that low. You'd think a lot more people would implement that stack starting with the 9-hole.
Yeah, for sure. I'm curious what your thoughts on this Buster Posey selection at catcher. So he was about 10% owned. So this is interesting. So they were facing Drew Pomeranz, the Giants were. And so it's not like this guy went like a full game stack, but this is something that we had talked about as a potential contrarian move. And I just sort of want to talk about this just real quick. What is the benefit of a full game stack? Do you think that there's like something to, teams, just putting up runs? Like, for example, we talked about in our PGA podcast, like the fact that and this is a little off topic, but the fact that in this past tournament, Henrik Stenson and Phil Mickelson, they played together at the end, and they were just like got into the zone, and these like elite athletes, these guys who are professional athletes, just sort of went pound for pound with each other, and like they each elevated each other's game. Do you think there's anything to that in baseball where like a higher implied team could maybe bring up the run total of another one?
I think it's pretty minuscule. You can look at some of the game flow of baseball in general and kind of think small ball terms. How many runs do they need to score? What's good cushion? If a team's up by a lot of runs, they might put in backup players, which brings their defense down if their starting defense is out. So I think you can look at it in that regard a little bit. But overall, I think game stacks for me are more for the starting pitchers. You look at both. You look at both bullpens. You obviously put a lot of weight into the park factor, the weather. I think those are more along the lines of stacking a game for me, the advantages of doing so, more so than one team that's implied for a lot of runs bringing up the other team.
Yeah, I agree with that. I didn't think that there was a whole lot there, but I was curious maybe if you had a different opinion. What else was interesting to you in this tournament, Jay?
I think the tournament overall, I wanted to touch up on just the $3. I mean, this is a tournament DraftKings has every single night. Paid out 14,900 people, which is about 29% of the field. First place getting $5K. So the max was 150 entries, which is pretty standard for this tournament. So $450 if you do want to max this tournament out. I thought an interesting stat, 4 people in the top 10 had 150 entries. So they put the max in, and only one team out of the top 10 had a single entry. So I think the way this tournament's designed with 51,000 entries, this is kind of a tournament where I suggest that you look at our new multi-lineup builder and kind of throw in more than one entry in this. I think with the size of the tournament, you want to get exposure to teams, build some mini stacks, get different exposure to pitchers, for example. So this is a tournament where I myself put multiple teams in every time I play. I think it's a little bit more on the difficult than throwing a single entry in this, but obviously I understand that not everybody can fire 150 entries in this tournament, but I do think you should at least throw a few in this, and that's probably my biggest takeaway from this tournament as a whole.
I agree completely, and I guess that gets into something that we can talk about before we end this one. Is let's say a person was only going to enter one team into this. If that's the case, if you're going to fire a single bullet, does that mean that you need to be even more contrarian than you would be if you? I mean, if you're entering, let's say, 100 lineups, is it okay to start chalky and then as you get to your 100th lineup, just sort of gradually get more contrarian? So you're having some exposure to the chalk and that core if it goes off, but then you can afford to do that and to get contrarian. As opposed to if you have a single bullet, do you think that you need to be just completely contrarian and willing to give away your $3?
Yeah, I kind of think you do, especially if this is a long-term strategy you're going to implement, is single entering these tournaments. You're going to need to get some ROI back. And I think if you only have one entry, it's just hard to win. If you do play it safe, maybe try to min cash these, double your money. I mean, the payouts are pretty typically top heavy. So I do think if you're throwing one each night in this, you do have to get quite a bit contrarian with the player size pool. So yeah, I think you should get pretty contrarian, mix up a lot of things, and you're going to lose a lot more. But when you do hit, that's where your ROI will be up there, consistently, hopefully over the long run.
All right, you're a guy that, if you're going to throw in 100 lineups, do you just do a lot of different stacks, a lot of different teams, or do you perhaps just, say, I'm going to put my money on maybe these 2 or 3 teams, and I'm going to stack them in different ways over my 100 lineups, and then fill those sort of just other hitters around them and mix up my pitching? So I guess the question is, do you believe in keeping a tight core, or do you believe in sort of distributing your exposure a little more in these tournaments?
I think it's a very common misconception that a lot of players have, like, oh, this guy at 150 entries, of course he's going to have this stack, or of course he's going to place 10, like Sahil last night got first, second, and third. You could look at that and say, well, he maxed entered, of course he is, but that's such a horrible ideology of thinking in these tournaments. If everybody could do that, then everybody would. It's not easy. So yeah, I think you definitely want to pinpoint a core. You still have to go through your overall research, whether you have one team or 150, and you still have to have a plan for what those teams, those players are going to look like, exposure percentages. So yeah, I find myself building cores. I think you have more leeway to kind of explore different strategies and advantages you can have. But overall, yeah, definitely get a core, lock it down, and then mix and match off that. Maybe select a pool of three pitchers total if you like those 3 pitchers a lot at their projected ownerships, and then get some stacks in there with them, or vice versa. Roll out a couple teams that you think are undervalued according to their Vegas lines, and then mix and match your pitchers. And I think that's what a lot of these top players do. If you track their lineups, that's kind of what you'll see has led to a lot of success.
Yeah, I'm 100% on the same page. I think the best strategy for bankroll management, just long-term ROI in these tournaments, is to keep as tight a core as possible. And really as tight a core as probably you can stomach. Like all of us have different amounts of risk tolerance, and that's just how we personally like to use our bankroll and like to enter these tournaments. But the tighter the core you can have, the better chances you have of actually taking down these tournaments. If you have 100 lineups and you distribute them all evenly with the team, and one team goes off, your chances of actually jumping up to the top is a lot lower than if you say, okay, I want to just go all in on Boston, and I'm going to have a bunch of different stacks. I'm going to have David Ortiz in some, but I also want to use some of my 100 lineups and mix in some Hanley, because I think that there's a good strategy there. And I'm also going to get the Boston stacks, but I want to mix in some lower pitchers like Hellickson or whoever you want to do. And that way is you can keep the upside, you can keep your core tight, but then get exposure to these other high upside plays that can jump you up to the top of the leaderboard, which is exactly what this guy did.
Yeah, definitely. I just think it's really lazy overall to just think that you can stack. If you have a lot of money, you can just stack every team and you're bound to hit. That's not what these guys do. You can look at the Brewers last night. Even they got 12 hits, 9 runs. You think that'd be a pretty good score, and you could stack similar teams like that every night. Just stack every team, but they didn't hit any home runs in that game, so the stack wasn't great. If you dug deeper, you'd see the Brewers are 25th in home runs as a team this season overall. So there are a lot of examples of entire fades you can use and kind of break down all of your teams together, your exposure to all these players, and have it make sense. I think just randomly picking stacks left and right is just very lazy. Long term, that's definitely not a winning strategy.
And also, if you're talking like a tournament that has 150 max entries that you can put in, if there's a 15 game slate, that means 30 teams. Even if you do the 2 most optimal stacks per team, you're already up to 60 lineups at that point. That's over a third of your total lineup. So at that point, even if you just use the rest of your 90 lineups on more optimal stacks, that's just a negative EV strategy in general. I think that the best idea, and like you said, the best players keep a tight core, and oftentimes that core doesn't hit. And that's just how playing tournaments is. But sometimes the core hits, and then those other guys that you have differentiated around your core, around your stack, goes off, and that is what jumps you up to your leaderboard and leads to huge nights like Sahil or like this guy in this $3 50K tournament.
Yeah, definitely.
For sure. All right. I'm good on this tournament unless you got anything else, Jay.
No, I think just if you want to play this tournament on Friday or just in the future, I think you can look at all these strategies we mentioned and kind of mix it up a little bit maybe. I think a lot of people are overall maybe a bit too chalky in their thinking for these tournaments. Overall as a team, like we talked about, I think you can have chalky plays but don't have a chalky team. And then as for tonight, as an example, I want to bring up just one more strategy real quick. And that's taking advantage of late scratches. We saw Starling Marte was scratched, I think, 10 minutes before lineups locked tonight. So using that as an example, we saw Matthew Joyce enter the lineup. And baseball is a sport where people aren't really paying attention up till that last second, especially the general public. So I think you can have a huge advantage there, taking the backup in that spot. I believe Joyce in the same tournament, the $3 was 1% owned, hit a 3-run home run in his first at bat. So those are things I think you can have an advantage, following our feed, getting the push notification that he's out, the new lineup all in a timely manner, giving you the opportunity to pivot to get a cleanup hitter at 1% is pretty big. So that's just one more strategy, along with kind of the positional pivot that I think you guys can try test out in these tournaments to come.
Yeah, for sure. That is a great point. Yeah, definitely late scratches are important in NBA. We know that NBA is crazy with those, but it is important for MLB and any other, late news on NFL is important too. All of these, just having them as much data as you can right up to lock is always important. So definitely a great point. Okay, great. Well, everyone, thanks for listening to this one. We will be back next week. We're going to pick a different tournament next Wednesday. It might be on DraftKings. It might be on FanDuel. It might be a high stakes, might be a low stakes. Who knows? I guess you'll have to tune in to find out. Thanks, Jay.
Yeah, thanks a lot. We'll see you guys soon.